The history of piracy is as old as our world. It probably began with the advent of seafaring and maritime trade. However, as trade relations between countries and peoples developed, robbery at sea came to be considered one of the most serious crimes. However, sometimes the authorities of a particular state would forget their hatred of pirates and make use of the services of sea robbers, setting them against their enemies. Official pirates were called privateers and corsairs. Interestingly, privateering was not considered shameful, even though corsairs were just as cruel and bloodthirsty as ordinary pirates. Over time, privateering became widespread and turned into a serious business. Sometimes privateers gained favor with royalty, and the most successful among them were granted noble titles. Most often, England, France, and Spain made use of the services of corsairs. Well, make yourself comfortable. We're going to talk about how privateers lived and what kind of order they established on their ships. Why were they in a more advantageous position compared to ordinary pirates who acted at their own risk? You'll also learn about the most famous privateers from different eras. My name is Semyon, and I declare the How They Lived section open. Let's begin. Where did privateers originate? Let's start perhaps with a definition. Privateers and corsairs are essentially synonymous terms. That's what they called private individuals who, with the government's permission, captured enemy merchant ships and sometimes even ships of neutral countries. One of the main goals of naval warfare at all times was the destruction of enemy trade, and privateers turned out to be almost the perfect tool for this. Privateers should not be confused with the raiders of the First and Second World Wars. They also operated on the enemy's sea lines of communication, but in this case, we are talking about ships of the regular navy. What distinguished a privateer from an ordinary pirate was the possession of a special license or commission that clearly spelled out which country's ships they were allowed to attack. The term caper is the oldest. It began to be used in Mediterranean countries as early as the 9th century. The term Corsair came into use later, around the 14th century, and it probably had Italian or French origins. Even later, the term privateer appeared, which was usually used to refer to English privateers. Attempts to recruit sea raiders into service were made as far back as ancient times. For example, the well-known Pontic king Mithridates Eupator used pirates in his wars against Rome. However, this practice became widespread only in the Middle Ages. It is believed that the first to issue privateering patents was the Aragonese king Alfonso III in 1288. He issued a special decree that clearly regulated the actions of privateers. Pirates in the service of the crown were instructed not to rob their fellow citizens, not to attack enemy ships during truces, and to honestly pay taxes on their loot. By the 14th and 15th centuries, laws regarding privateering appeared in all European countries. For example, French privateers were instructed to bring captured ships to port intact, so that the authorities could verify their ownership by the enemy and, of course, take their share. It was strictly forbidden to loot the cargo from the ship, to treat the crew harshly, or to attack neutrals. Breaking the law threatened the privateer with fines, or worse, the loss of his letter of marque. As early as the 15th century, international treaties were concluded that regulated the activities of privateers, but the golden age of privateering came in the early modern period. In the 16th and 17th centuries, three main centers of conflict emerged in the world, where wars and conflicts most often broke out. In the West, Europe, and the New World, the colonial interests of the four leading powers of that time, Spain, France, England, and the Netherlands, constantly clashed. By the 16th century, relations between Europe and the Ottoman Empire had sharply deteriorated, turning the Mediterranean Sea into a stage of constant conflicts and battles. And finally, in the northeast of Europe, the great powers fought for dominance over the Baltic Sea for 3 centuries. Privateers were actively operating in all these hotspots. The Dutch were the first to use privateers on a large scale. During the War for Independence, they fiercely attacked Spanish ships, not only off the coast of Europe, but even near the Cape of Good Hope. In the second half of the 16th century, the star of the most famous privateer, the Englishman Francis Drake, rose. French privateers gave rise to piracy in the New World. It should be added here that until the middle of the 17th century, the main targets of privateer attacks were Portuguese and Spanish ships, since these countries had effectively monopolized trade with the West Indies. During this period, privateering became so significant that, for example, France included it in its official naval doctrine. With the help of privateers, the French intended to catch up with their main competitors at sea, the English and the Dutch, while spending much less money on it. And besides, privateering brought crazy profits to the treasury. The French Minister of Finance included its revenues when drawing up the state budget. Privateering flourished during the Napoleonic Wars. The area of greatest Corsair activity was the English Channel. However, ships were also captured in the West Indies and in the Indian Ocean. After the United States gained independence, privateers became the main force of the young American Navy. Privateering caused enormous damage to global trade, so as early as the middle of the 18th century, people were already calling for its complete ban. The French Legislative Assembly was the first to officially propose such a step in 1792. And although this initiative was not supported by the leading naval powers, with each passing year there was a growing understanding that privateering was little different from ordinary piracy. Already during the Crimean War, England and France officially abandoned the use of privateers. In 1856, the Paris Declaration respecting maritime law was adopted, which explicitly prohibited the practice of privateering. Over time, all European and American states joined it. Pirates and privateers, so what's the difference? Most modern authors believe that the boundaries between privateering and ordinary piracy were extremely vague, and often the thirst for profit made sailors cross those boundaries. As I mentioned before, the main thing that distinguished a privateer from a pirate was the presence of a special commission or letter of marque, allowing them to capture and plunder the enemies of the state at sea. That's why privateers were considered quite law-abiding, even though they were engaged in a rather shady business. But a pirate was always a criminal and a villain who deserved only one thing, a noose around his neck. A privateer was in government service, so if he was captured, he could hope for the status of a prisoner of war, although there were a lot of nuances here as well. For example, the Spaniards considered Francis Drake to be just an ordinary pirate. If he had fallen into their hands, he would hardly have been able to enjoy his noble title. Privateers had the right to officially sell what they had legally seized, which made this line of work profitable. In addition, they could replenish supplies and repair their ships in friendly or neutral ports. This was also important. It can't be said that there were any special rules on privateer ships. The conditions on board were extremely harsh. There was strict discipline. The captain's word was considered law for the crew, but that's how it was on any ship of the age of sail. It should be noted that the first regulations in the English Navy appeared only in the mid-18th century. However, pirates chose their own captains and could always demote them. Overall, the life of a privateer was not easy. For every successful privateer, there were 10 to 12 failures who went bankrupt or barely made ends meet. Privateering was always considered a business, but it was like a lottery in which not everyone was lucky. Merchants did not always surrender their ships without a fight, and regular Navy ships hunted privateers. That's why privateers often died. For example, during the Napoleonic Wars, about 700 French privateers were sunk. Now let's talk about the most famous privateers, who not only achieved brilliant victories at sea, but also had a serious influence on the politics of their countries. Francis Drake. Francis Drake is undoubtedly the most famous sea raider, who not only gained wealth and fame for himself, but also did much for the greatness of his homeland. Today people talk about such men. He was self-made, and that's the absolute truth. Francis Drake was born into the family of a poor nobleman, and as a boy ran away to sea as a cabin boy. In his youth, Drake took part in a slave trading expedition to West Africa. It wasn't very successful, but it brought attention to Drake. In 1573, Drake landed on the Isthmus of Panama with a small detachment and captured a Spanish convoy that was transporting silver and gold. There was so much loot that the pirates had to bury most of it. On his next expedition to seize Spanish gold, Drake set out at the head of an entire flotilla of 5 ships. In 2 years, he traveled from the Atlantic coast of South America to Panama, but this time on the shores of the Pacific Ocean. However, he could no longer return home via Cape Horn, as an entire Spanish squadron was waiting for Drake there. So he headed west across the Pacific Ocean, completing the second circumnavigation in history. Spain was furious and demanded that Queen Elizabeth of England hand over Drake. The issue was settled by a small gift that the successful privateer presented to the Queen. It was roughly equal to 2 national budgets of England. In honor of the circumnavigation, Drake gave the Queen a precious token made of enameled gold and adorned with an African diamond. After that, Elizabeth came aboard Drake's flagship and personally knighted him. In 1588, Francis Drake, holding the rank of vice admiral, took part in battles against the Spanish Armada. Despite their overwhelming advantage, the Spanish were defeated. They lost most of their ships and retreated. Drake died during his last expedition from dysentery and was buried at sea. The news of the famous pirate's death caused national mourning in England and widespread rejoicing in Spain. Today, Drake is considered a national hero, although in reality, he was a pirate, cruel, bloodthirsty, and greedy. Henry Morgan. Henry Morgan is a figure from the so-called golden age of piracy in the New World. He was such a vivid character that he became the prototype for the heroes of the most famous pirate novels. We know little about Morgan's early years. At a young age, he moved to the West Indies, where he first appears in the records in 1665. Together with his companions, he bought a small boat and set out to plunder Spanish ships and settlements. Morgan proved himself to be a successful leader, so within a few years he received official permission to wage war against the Spanish. Morgan captured and plundered cities, stormed Spanish fortresses, and boarded ships. He was an excellent strategist, yet he didn't hesitate to use underhanded tactics. For example, during the assault on one of the cities, the pirates fired while using a living shield made of captured priests and nuns. Morgan's pirates subjected prisoners to the most brutal tortures to find out where valuables were hidden. Morgan managed to capture several large and wealthy Spanish cities, including Panama. There, the pirates took enormous loot. It took 175 mules to carry it away. The British authorities duly appreciated Morgan's exploits. In 1674, he was knighted, and soon after he was appointed as the Lieutenant Governor of Jamaica. Henry Morgan died of cirrhosis of the liver and was buried in Jamaica at St. Catherine's Church. And a few years later, a powerful earthquake wiped both the church and the grave of the famous privateer off the face of the earth. Hayreddin Barbarossa is probably the most famous pirate of the Mediterranean Sea, a true symbol of the confrontation between East and West. He was born on the Greek island of Lesbos, which at that time was ruled by the powerful Ottoman Empire. Khayr ad-Din took up piracy at sea from a very young age. Together with his older brother, he created one of the most daring and successful pirate bands, which struck terror throughout the entire Mediterranean. In 1516, they captured Algiers, and after his brother's death, Khayr ad-Din inherited not only vast territories but also his brother's nickname, Barbarossa, which meant red beard. The famous pirate really did have a red beard, had an extremely fierce appearance, was known for his great physical strength, and was fearless in battle. Barbarossa proclaimed himself the Sultan of Algiers and became a vassal of the Ottoman Empire. At the same time, his main occupation remained piracy and raids on coastal territories. Khayr ad-Din was an excellent strategist and tactician of naval warfare. That is why Suleiman the Magnificent appointed him as the commander-in-chief of the entire Turkish fleet. The squadron under his command defeated the combined fleet of Venice, Genoa, and the Order of Malta. Hayreddin's pirates became a real nightmare for the inhabitants of the coastal regions of southern Europe. Under Hayreddin's leadership, the Turkish fleet became the main power in the Mediterranean. Barbarossa lived to an old age and died a natural death, which was unusual for people of his profession. He was buried in a specially built mosque. They wrote on his tomb, "Here lies the master of the sea." The mosque stands on the shore, and for many years Turkish ships passing by would salute Barbarossa. Piet Hein. At the end of the 16th century, the Dutch rose up against the rule of Catholic Spain. Thus began the Dutch War of Independence, which lasted for 80 years. The fighting took place not only on land, but also at sea. And here, privateers played a huge role, inflicting massive damage on the Spanish fleet. The most successful Dutch privateer was Piet Hein. As a young man, Piet Hein joined the navy, but his service was not very successful. However, the young man managed to be captured by the Spanish twice. After escaping from captivity, Hein quit the navy and became a privateer. Here his career took off, and in 1624 he was promoted to vice admiral. At the head of a small flotilla, Piet Hein carried out a daring raid on Brazil. He plundered its then capital, the city of Bahia. There was so much loot that it had to be taken away on 11 captured ships. Later, Hein managed to capture part of the Silver Fleet, a huge squadron that the Spanish used to transport treasures from their American colonies. The Dutch took valuables worth 11 million guilders, which became the largest loot in the history of piracy. A few years after his triumph, Hein was killed by a stray cannonball in a skirmish with Spanish Corsairs. Amaro Pargo. People usually refer to the English or Ottomans when discussing privateers, though many other nations also had daring men. For example, the most famous Spanish privateer was Amaro Pargo, who became one of the richest men of his time thanks to piracy. Amaro Pargo grew up in a wealthy merchant family in the Canary Islands, but he didn't want to follow in his parents' footsteps and joined the Navy at the age of 21. A few years later, he bought a privateering license and began successfully raiding English and Dutch ships. In addition, Pargo did not shy away from slave trading, which was actually the main source of income for the pirate. At the same time, Amaro was a devout Catholic, generously donated to charity, and was friends with priests and nuns. It's hard to say how his piety coexisted with slave trading and piracy. Amaro Pargo lived to an old age and died a natural death. In Spain, he is considered almost a national hero, rivaling Francis Drake in popularity in England. Privateers in the service of the Russian Empire. The Russian Tsars also resorted to the help of privateers, although of course they did this not as often as the rulers of Western Europe. The pioneer in this matter was Ivan the Terrible, who began issuing privateer patents during the Livonian War. It must be said that this was a forced measure in response to Polish and Swedish privateers who were robbing ships heading to Narva. The most famous privateer of Ivan the Terrible was the Dane Karsten Rode. The next time privateers were mentioned was during the Northern War. Several small ships were equipped to operate against enemy lines of communication. Later, the Russian naval regulations specifically outlined procedures for privateers to inspect and seize enemy ships. The section on reward distribution among the crew and rules for handling captured crews. The Russian Empire actively used privateers in the Mediterranean and Black Seas during the Russo-Turkish Wars in the late 18th century. For these purposes, Greek sailors were often recruited, who not only fiercely hated the Ottomans, but also knew the theater of operations very well. The most famous Greek privateer in Russian service was Ioannis Varvakis, who received an officer's patent and 1,000 gold coins from Catherine II. An even more colorful figure was John Paul Jones, an American of Scottish descent, who rose to the rank of vice admiral in the Russian Navy. He was a friend of Thomas Jefferson, the author of the U.S. Declaration of Independence, and was the first to raise the American flag on his ship. John Paul Jones captured more than 30 English ships for which he received the Medal of Honor, the highest award of the United States. However, after the war ended, he was left without a job, so he gladly accepted an offer from Catherine II to fight against the Turks. The American privateer distinguished himself in his new service, sinking and capturing several ships. He proposed that the Russian government form an alliance with the United States for operations in the Mediterranean against England. This plan was thwarted by the sudden death of Paul Jones. The admiral was highly respected. In the United States, several warships were named after him. Instead of an epilogue, privateering is undoubtedly one of the most interesting chapters in naval history. With the backing of the state, privateers could carry out operations on a scale that ordinary pirates could only dream of. Many privateers were extraordinary individuals, capable not only of carrying out brilliant operations, but also of successfully navigating the sea of political intrigue. The era of privateering began to decline as international trade developed. When the leading naval powers finally realized that legalized piracy caused much more harm than it could ever bring benefit during wartime. That's all. Thank you for watching and see you in the next episode. Bye.